Tessa Landry stood in the middle of the most exclusive restaurant in Chicago, a silver tray in her hand, staring straight at the manager who was pointing his finger at her face in front of dozens of employees. "Get out. You don't belong in this restaurant." She didn't argue. She didn't cry. She set the tray down, untied her apron, and walked out. Behind her, laughter from coworkers who had stolen her tips for months. Ahead of her, a November Chicago street, wind cutting through skin, and a future with nothing left. All because she dared to offer a seat to an old woman dressed in worn-out clothes, pour her a warm glass of water, and say, "Take your time, ma'am." But that old woman was no ordinary person. She was Edith Prescott, the woman who built the Prescott Empire from nothing. And her grandson, Holden Prescott, was the most powerful man in Chicago. The man the entire underworld called by just 2 words, the boss. This story is no fairy tale. This is the story of an orphan girl the world kept pushing down, whose kindness reached the heart of a man no one dared to touch. A story of betrayal, traps, kidnapping, and a life nearly lost. But above all, this is a story about dignity. Something no one can buy, and no one can take away. If you believe that human dignity can never be bought or sold, hit the like button for this story. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message today. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next story. 2 hours earlier, Tessa Landry had walked into her evening shift at the gilded table in shoes with worn-down heels and a smile she practiced putting on every single day. It was the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, the kind of place where one dinner could cost as much as her entire monthly paycheck. Tessa had worked there for 6 months. 6 months was long enough for her to understand that this place wasn't meant for someone like her. But she needed the money. Every month, she sent part of her wages back to the orphanage where she had grown up, and the rest was just enough to pay rent on her tiny room out in the suburbs. Tessa looked at the shift schedule on the wall. Tonight, she was assigned to serve the VIP section. She had been waiting for this turn all week, because VIP guests tipped more generously. But just as she picked up her tray and prepared to step into the dining room, Denise Carver's voice rang out behind her. "Tessa, you're cleaning the kitchen today." Tessa turned around. "Today is my turn in the VIP section, Denise." Denise didn't even bother to look at her. "Your turn is whatever I say it is. Get into the kitchen." 2 employees standing nearby covered their mouths and laughed. One of them whispered just loudly enough for her to hear, "Let her get used to washing dishes." Tessa tightened her grip on the tray. She wanted to say more, but she knew saying more wouldn't change anything. She set the tray down and walked into the kitchen. Nearly 2 hours later, Tessa had just finished cleaning the kitchen, sweat damp on her forehead, her apron stained with grease. She stepped into the main dining room to get a drink of water when the glass door at the front opened. An old woman walked in. Her coat was old, the shoulders frayed. Her canvas shoes had soles worn thin. Her silver hair was hastily twisted into a bun with a plastic clip. She stood in the middle of that glittering restaurant, small and out of place. The hostess looked up, her face turning cold at once. "Ma'am, our restaurant only serves guests with prior reservations." The old woman smiled gently. "I just want to sit and rest for a little while." Before the hostess could answer, Denise had already walked over, looking the woman up and down. "This isn't a place to rest your feet. Security, please escort her outside." The old woman didn't look angry. She only stood there quietly, her eyes moving around the room as though she were searching for something. Tessa stood beside the bar, looking at the old woman, then at Denise, then at the 2 security guards moving toward them. She didn't think for long. She walked straight over and stood between the old woman and the guards. "I'll handle it," Tessa said to the guards, her voice calm. Then she turned to the old woman and said softly, "Please sit here. I'll get you a glass of water." The old woman looked at Tessa, and her wrinkled eyes brightened. "Thank you, child." Tessa led her to a small table by the window, pulled out a chair for her, then brought her a glass of warm water. Denise stood at a distance with her arms folded, her eyes narrowing, but she didn't say anything yet. The old woman took a sip of water, set the glass down, then looked at Tessa. "Young lady, I'd like to book a dinner table for 10 people, the most expensive menu in the restaurant." Tessa blinked. 10 people, ma'am? That's right. Whatever is the best. Whatever is the most expensive. Choose it for me." Several employees nearby turned to one another and smirked. One of them muttered, "What's she going to pay with? Those torn-up shoes?" Tessa didn't turn around. She nodded to the old woman, took out her notepad, and began working. For nearly an hour, Tessa hurried back and forth between the kitchen and the table, carrying out one dish after another, arranging each plate neatly, explaining every course to the old woman. The old woman nodded, tasted the food, and praised it. Tessa smiled, and for the first time that day, it was a real smile. When the final dish was brought out, the old woman looked over the banquet spread before her and nodded with satisfaction. "Wonderful. I'll take it all." Tessa felt a quiet rush of joy. Tonight's bill came to more than $20,000. This could be the largest tip she had ever received. She brought the bill over and gently placed it in front of the old woman. The old woman looked at the bill, then slowly searched the pockets of her coat. She searched her pants pockets. Then she searched her coat pockets again. Finally, she lifted her head and smiled awkwardly. "Oh, child, I forgot to bring my wallet." The entire restaurant went silent for exactly 1 second, then laughter burst out. The employees laughed. The guards laughed. Denise stepped forward, the corner of her mouth curving upward. "I told you. People like you don't belong here." Tessa stood beside the table, looking at the old woman. The old woman didn't argue. She didn't explain. She only sat there, her wrinkled hands resting on the table, her eyes lowered slightly. Tessa felt her chest tighten. She knew that feeling. The feeling of having the whole world laugh in your face. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small handful of money. It was all the tip money she had saved for the entire month. She placed it on the table in front of Denise. "I'll pay for her water." Then Tessa turned to the old woman and said softly, "It's all right, ma'am. Please go home and rest. Don't think about any of this." The old woman looked at Tessa, her eyes trembling. She took Tessa's hand, her voice falling to a whisper. "You're a good person. Remember that." Denise looked at the money on the table, then looked at Tessa. The manager's eyes went cold. At that same moment, about 5 miles from the gilded table, in the basement of Prescott Tower, another meeting was taking place. There were no candles, no gold-plated menus. There was only a long oak table, 6 chairs, and 6 men sitting as still as statues. At the head of the table sat Holden Prescott, 33 years old, wearing a black suit, with the mechanical watch his grandfather had left him on his wrist. Holden didn't speak much. He rarely spoke much, but when he opened his mouth, the entire room stopped breathing. In Chicago's underworld, people called him by 2 words: the boss. Not because he shouted, slammed tables, or made threats, but because he didn't need to do any of that. Holden controlled everything with silence. And tonight, that silence was pressing down on the shoulders of the man standing in the middle of the room. Ray Shelton, 50 years old, salt and pepper hair, his hands clasped tightly together in front of his stomach. Ray had followed Holden for 12 years, since the Prescott Empire hadn't even been 1/10 of what it was today. He was the most loyal man, at least until last week, when Franklin placed a financial file on Holden's desk with numbers that didn't match. Holden opened the file and slowly turned page after page. The room was so quiet that the sound of paper being turned was clear. Then he stopped, his finger resting on one line of figures. $480,000. Holden's voice was soft, ordinary, as though he were reading a restaurant menu. 12 years. And you sold me for $480,000. Ray swallowed. Sweat dotted his forehead. "Holden, I've followed you for 12 years. Give me one chance. I have a family. I have." Holden lifted his eyes and looked at Ray. Just looked. No frown, no clenched teeth. Just a straight look into the eyes of the man who had sat at his dinner table every Christmas for a decade. 12 years of loyalty. Holden said slowly, "How much would you price it at, Ray?" Ray opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Holden closed the file and placed it neatly in front of him. "You leave Chicago before the sun rises. Don't make me say it twice." Ray stood there for a few more seconds, as though waiting for some miracle to change the sentence that had just been spoken. But Holden had already lowered his gaze back to the document in front of him. For him, the conversation was over. 2 bodyguards stepped forward and placed their hands on Ray's shoulders. Gently but firmly, Ray was escorted out of the room. The door closed. Holden didn't look after him. He sat still for a moment, then lifted his eyes to the 5 men remaining around the table. One by one, slowly, his gaze stopped on each man long enough for them to feel its weight. "Does anyone else want to try?" No one answered. No one moved. One man swallowed. Another looked down at the tabletop. Holden gave a small nod, then opened the next file on the table and began reading the new figures, as though what had just happened were nothing more than a minor item on tonight's list of work. That was Holden Prescott, the man who never raised his voice, because he didn't need to. 10 minutes later, the meeting room door opened. Franklin stepped in, his gray suit perfectly pressed, his face expressionless as always. Franklin was Holden's right hand, the only person allowed to enter this room without knocking. "Boss," Franklin said briefly, "Mrs. Edith is back. She wants to see you." Holden's hand stopped in the middle of the page. His grandmother rarely demanded to see him at this hour. She even more rarely went out alone in the evening. He closed the file, stood, and buttoned his suit jacket. "Where is she?" "The main sitting room. She seems happy," Franklin replied. Holden frowned slightly. His grandmother being happy at 10 o'clock at night after a mysterious outing was either very good or very troublesome. He left the basement, took the private elevator up, and headed toward the main sitting room of the Prescott mansion. He didn't yet know that tonight, his grandmother would tell him about a waitress who had used an entire month's worth of tip money to pay for a glass of warm water for a strange old woman, and his life would never be the same again. Holden walked into the mansion's main sitting room. Edith was seated in her familiar armchair, both hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes wrinkled with age yet shining brightly. She told Holden everything, about the restaurant, about the way the staff had tried to drive her out, about the only girl who had invited her to sit down, poured her warm water, served her for an entire hour, then paid out of her own pocket when Edith said she had forgotten her wallet. Holden listened, and when she finished, he didn't ask a single question. He took out his phone and called Franklin. "Pull up the security cameras from the gilded table. Evening shift. Go back 2 hours." 5 minutes later, Holden was sitting in his study, the screen in front of him replaying everything that had happened. He saw the hostess shooing his grandmother away. He saw Denise ordering security to escort her out. Then he saw that girl. She stepped out from the kitchen area, her apron stained with grease, her small figure standing in the middle of the glittering dining room. She placed herself between his grandmother and the guards, calm, not trembling. Holden fast-forwarded to the final part. The girl reached into the pocket of her apron, pulled out a handful of crumpled bills, and placed them on the table in front of Denise. Holden looked at that small pile of money on the screen. He knew how much servers at the gilded table were paid. He knew that handful of money could have been everything the girl had, and she gave it away for a strange old woman she had never met. Holden turned off the screen and sat in silence for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and called the restaurant's regional manager, Denise Carver, manager of the gilded table. "Don't fire her." The other end of the line went silent for a few seconds, then asked, "Sir, why?" Holden answered briefly, "I'll handle it myself." Then he hung up. The next morning, while Holden was still in a meeting with Franklin, Edith quietly left the mansion. She didn't tell her grandson. She called a taxi and gave the driver the address of the area near the train station on the south side, where she guessed that girl might live. She didn't know the girl's name. She didn't know her address, but she remembered the worn-down heels and the outfit that had been washed so many times it had faded. People who lived in expensive neighborhoods didn't dress like that. Edith walked along 2 streets, past 3 coffee shops, and then she saw her. Tessa was sitting on a park bench near the train station, holding a large cloth bag filled with a few hastily folded pieces of clothing. Beside her feet was a small cardboard box with a few books and a spare pair of shoes inside. She wasn't crying. She was only sitting there, watching people pass by, as though trying to figure out what the next step was supposed to be. Edith sat down beside her, leaving just enough space between them. Neither of them looked at the other. "You lost your job yesterday because of me," Edith said softly. Tessa turned. She recognized the old woman from yesterday, but she didn't look surprised. Perhaps she had no room left inside her for surprise anymore. "I lost my job because I chose to do the right thing. It has nothing to do with you," Tessa replied. Edith looked at the cloth bag by Tessa's feet. "You were thrown out of your home? The landlord couldn't wait anymore. I was 2 months behind on rent. Losing my job meant losing the last place I had to stay," Tessa said, her voice as calm as if she were talking about the weather. Edith was silent for a while. Then she asked, slowly and clearly, "Do you regret it? Helping me, then losing your job, losing your home, losing everything?" Tessa looked straight ahead. A few seconds passed. Then she answered without turning her head, "I'd do it again. 4 words. Edith heard those 4 words, and she knew she hadn't been wrong about this girl. She stood, gently patted Tessa's shoulder, and said, "Take care of yourself." Then she called a taxi and returned to the mansion. Holden was standing in his study when Edith walked in. She told him about that morning, about the girl sitting on the park bench, holding her bag of belongings, jobless and homeless, without shedding a single tear. About the answer made of 4 words. Holden listened, standing still beside the window, looking out over the city of Chicago stretching below. He said nothing for nearly 1 minute. Then he stood, reached for the coat hanging on the hook, and took it down. Edith watched her grandson and smiled. She didn't ask where he was going. She didn't need to ask. That afternoon, Holden Prescott did something he hadn't done once in all the 10 years he had run the Prescott empire. He went alone. No Franklin, no bodyguards, no private car. He wore an ordinary dark coat, no suit, no mechanical watch from his grandfather. He took the train to the southern part of Chicago, stepped off at the station, and walked 2 blocks to the park near the train stop where his grandmother had told him that girl was sitting. Tessa was still there, the same stone bench, the same cloth bag at her feet. She was holding an old newspaper, turned to the job listings, using a ballpoint pen to circle a few lines. Holden watched her from a distance for a few seconds. He had seen her through security footage. He had heard his grandmother talk about her. But this was the first time he had seen her with his own eyes. She was smaller than he had imagined, thinner, but the way she sat, her back straight, her eyes focused on the newspaper, there was nothing about her that looked like someone who had given up. Holden walked over and sat down at the other end of the stone bench, about half a meter from Tessa. He didn't look at her. He only looked straight ahead, acting like an ordinary man out for a walk who had sat down to rest his feet. Tessa glanced over, then turned back to the newspaper. A few seconds passed. Holden spoke first. "Are you looking for work?" His voice was ordinary, not cold, not warm, the voice of someone making casual conversation on a park bench. Tessa didn't look up. "I'm looking. Found anything yet?" "No," Tessa answered briefly, still not looking his way. She was used to strangers starting conversations in parks. Most of them wanted to ask for money, or sell something, or invite her somewhere she didn't want to go. Holden gave a small nod. "I'm hiring." This time, Tessa turned toward him. She looked him over from head to toe. Dark coat, simple trousers, leather shoes, but not the kind that stood out as expensive. He looked like a middle manager at some company, or the owner of a small shop who needed extra staff. Nothing special. "Who are you?" Tessa asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Someone who needs to hire an employee," Holden replied, still looking straight ahead. Tessa said nothing. She had lived long enough to know that when a strange man approached her on a park bench and said, "I'm hiring," the next sentence usually had nothing to do with work. "Thank you. I'm not interested," Tessa said, turning back to the newspaper. Holden took a business card from his coat pocket. The card was simple, white, with only 2 lines. Prescott Tower and a phone number. No name, no title. He placed the card on the stone bench between them. "Monday morning. Come to this address. Ask the receptionist for me." Tessa looked at the card but didn't pick it up. "I don't even know your name." Holden had already stood. He brushed his coat lightly and said without turning back, "You'll know when you come." Then he walked away, his hands in his coat pockets, his posture straight, his steps even, blending into the crowd on the sidewalk, as though he had never sat on that stone bench at all. Tessa watched the strange man's back until he disappeared around the corner. Then she looked down at the business card, Prescott Tower. She picked it up and turned it over in her hand. No name, no logo, no company, only an address and a phone number. That night, Tessa sat inside a 24-hour coffee shop near the train station, where she took shelter for the night by ordering the cheapest cup of coffee and staying there until morning. She used her old phone to search for the words, Prescott Tower, Chicago. The screen showed an image of a glass and steel tower more than 40 stories high, the headquarters of Prescott Empire, one of the largest business empires in Chicago. Tessa looked at the business card, then looked back at the tower on the screen. She couldn't sleep that night. At 7 o'clock on Monday morning, Tessa stood in front of the entrance to Prescott Tower. She wore the cleanest clothes she still had. A white shirt that had been washed so many times the fabric had grown thin, and the only pair of black trousers she owned that didn't have a stain on them. She looked up at the soaring glass tower, took a deep breath, and stepped through the revolving door. She didn't yet know that the man on the park bench that afternoon hadn't been a middle manager. He was the owner of the entire tower standing before her. Tessa walked up to the reception desk on the ground floor of Prescott Tower, where a woman in a black uniform sat behind a pane of glass. She placed the business card on the counter. "I have an appointment. This person told me to come and ask reception." The woman picked up the card, turned it over, then lifted the internal phone. She spoke a few brief words, hung up, then looked at Tessa with an expression entirely different from before, no longer cold, a little surprised, even a little respectful. "Please follow me." Tessa was led to the private elevator at the end of the lobby, the kind of elevator that had only one button. The steel doors closed, and the elevator took her straight to the highest floor. When the doors opened, Tessa stepped into a wide hallway, the stone floor polished until it shone, the ceiling high, natural light pouring in through large glass panels that looked out over all of Chicago. At the end of the hallway was an oak door already standing open, and there, framed in the doorway, one hand in his trouser pocket, his back resting lightly against a bookshelf, was the man from the park bench. But today, he wasn't wearing that simple dark coat anymore. A black suit, an antique mechanical watch on his wrist, his posture straight, his gaze sharp. He looked like a completely different man. Tessa stood frozen in the middle of the hallway. She looked at him, looked at the room, then looked at the words Prescott Empire engraved into the wooden panel behind the desk. She understood now. The man who had sat beside her on the park bench, asked if she was looking for work, and handed her a business card with no name on it, was the owner of this entire tower. "You came," Holden said, his voice calm, with no hint of surprise, as if he had known for certain that she would. "Why didn't you tell me who you were?" Tessa asked, her voice not angry, but not pleased either. Holden hadn't had time to answer when a familiar voice came from the armchair in the corner of the room. "Because I told him not to." Tessa turned. Edith was sitting there, a cup of tea in her hand, smiling from ear to ear. The old woman from the restaurant, the old woman from the park bench, now seated in the office on the highest floor of an empire. "You." Tessa couldn't get the word out. Edith set down her teacup, stood, walked over, and took both of Tessa's hands. "I wanted to see whether you would come because of the person, or because of the Prescott name. You came because of a business card from a stranger on a park bench. That's enough." Tessa stood in the middle of the room, her mind spinning. Everything was happening too fast. 2 days ago, she had still been washing dishes in a restaurant kitchen. Yesterday, she had been sitting on a park bench, not knowing where she would sleep that night. And now she was standing on the highest floor of Prescott Tower. Holden walked to the desk, took out an envelope, and placed it in front of Tessa. "Inside this are the keys to an apartment on the 23rd floor of this building, free of charge. Or, if you don't want to stay here, I'll pay your rent for 6 months anywhere you choose. Consider it a loan. Pay it back whenever you can." Tessa looked at the envelope. She didn't touch it. "I don't take money from strangers. I only need a job." Holden looked at her. He had seen many people standing in this room. Partners, enemies, job applicants, people begging for mercy. No one had ever refused anything he offered. Never. "You're turning down a free apartment?" he asked. Not because he hadn't heard her, but because he wanted to make sure he hadn't heard wrong. "I'm turning down anything I didn't earn myself," Tessa replied, her voice not hard, but clear. Holden was silent for a few seconds. Then he gave a slight nod. "Fine. I have an open receptionist position on the ground floor. Standard company salary. You start Tuesday." Edith cut in from behind him. "But while you're waiting for your first paycheck, where will you stay? You have to have somewhere to sleep. Stay with me for now. The guest room in the mansion is large, and I'm there all by myself. Stay with me so I'll have someone to talk to." Tessa looked at Edith. The old woman held her hand, her wrinkled eyes gentle. Tessa wanted to refuse, but she knew she had nowhere to go tonight. She nodded. "Only temporarily. Once I get paid, I'll find my own place." Edith smiled brightly and held Tessa's hand tighter. Holden stood beside the desk, looking at the two of them without saying anything. But the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, so quickly that almost no one would have noticed. That afternoon, Tessa placed her cloth bag in the guest room of the Prescott mansion. She had just finished putting a few pieces of clothing into a drawer when the roar of an engine sounded outside the gate. A red sports car shot through the entrance and braked sharply on the stone driveway. The car door opened, and a woman stepped out. Long brown hair, designer handbag, high heels striking the stone with a cold, sharp sound. Monica Hale walked straight into the mansion as though it belonged to her. She stepped through the front door, saw Tessa standing in the middle of the sitting room, and stopped. Monica's eyes swept Tessa from head to toe. Thin white shirt, wrinkled black trousers, shoes with worn-down heels. Monica gave a mocking smile. "Who let you in here?" "This is the Prescott Mansion, not a shelter for homeless people." Tessa clenched her hand, but before she could answer, Holden stepped out from the hallway. "Monica." His voice was flat. Monica turned toward him and gave him a sweet smile. "Holden, I came to see you." "Who is this girl?" "She's my grandmother's guest." Monica raised an eyebrow. "Guest? She looks like—" "Monica." Holden cut her off, his voice not raised, but sharp enough to stop Monica in the middle of her sentence. "You're the daughter of my father's old friend." "Nothing more. Don't forget that." Monica stood there, her smile frozen on her lips. She looked at Holden, looked at Tessa, then looked back at Holden again. Her eyes darkened. No one said another word. Monica turned on her heel and walked out, her heels striking the stone floor faster than when she had come in. The engine roared, and the car sped out through the gate. Tessa stood in the sitting room, her heart still beating fast. She looked at Holden. He looked at her, gave a slight nod, then turned and walked away, as though what had just happened wasn't worth saying anything more about. But Tessa knew the look in Monica's eyes when she turned away. It wasn't the look of someone giving up. It was the look of someone making a plan. 3 weeks passed. Tessa Landry arrived at Prescott Tower every morning at 7 o'clock, earlier than any other employee on the ground floor. She sat behind the reception desk, wearing the company's black uniform, her hair tied neatly back, her smile just polite enough for everyone who walked through the doors. No one knew she was staying inside the Prescott mansion. No one knew she had once sat drinking tea with the boss's grandmother. To everyone on the ground floor, Tessa was only the new receptionist, quiet, hard-working, and not the kind of person who caused trouble. She memorized the names of every department head in the building during her first week. By the second week, she could remember the meeting schedules for 3 management floors. By the third week, she knew that the chief financial officer took his coffee as a double espresso with no sugar, and that the head of legal was allergic to peanuts, so the pastries in the conference room must never be ordered wrong. She didn't do those things because anyone asked her to. She did them because that was what she was used to doing. 6 months of waiting tables at the Gilded Table had taught her that remembering small details was the only way to survive when no one really saw you. One Thursday afternoon, the ground floor lobby was quiet when the main doors suddenly flew open. A middle-aged man walked in, his face flushed red, his tie hanging loose, his steps unsteady. He went straight to the reception desk, slammed his hand down on the counter, and slurred, "Call Holden Prescott down here for me, right now." The receptionist sitting beside Tessa pushed her chair back, her eyes wide. 2 security guards standing near the door looked at each other, but neither one stepped forward. He was a major business partner of Prescott Empire. Touching him could cost someone their job. Not touching him could mean letting him tear apart the lobby. He slammed his hand down a second time, harder. "I said call Holden down here. Are you people deaf?" Tessa stood. She stepped out from behind the reception desk and walked straight up to him, no circling around, no backing away. She stopped less than 1 step from him, her back straight, her eyes looking directly into his. "Sir, Mr. Prescott is in a meeting, and he isn't available to receive guests right now." Her voice was calm, clear, and it didn't tremble. The man lunged forward. "Who are you? Do you know who I am?" Tessa didn't move back. "I know who you are. And I also know that there are more than 30 people in this lobby watching you right now. I'm the only person here helping you save face in front of those 30 people." The man froze. His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked around, realizing for the first time that the entire lobby had gone completely silent and was watching him. Employees, visitors, security, all of them were looking. Tessa continued, her voice still soft. "I can schedule an appointment for you tomorrow morning, or I can call a car to take you home so you can rest first. Either choice is yours." The man looked at Tessa. A few seconds passed, then he lowered his hand from the counter, pulled over a nearby sofa chair, and sat down. "Call me a car," he said, his voice much lower now. Tessa nodded, returned to the desk, and picked up the phone to call a car. 10 minutes later, he got into the car and left. No noise. No need for security. The lobby returned to normal. The receptionist sitting beside Tessa looked at her, her eyes still round. "How were you not afraid?" Tessa smiled faintly. "I was afraid." But he was afraid too. He just didn't know what he was afraid of yet. On the 42nd floor, Franklin sat in front of the security camera screen, watching everything that had just happened. He picked up the phone and called Holden. "Boss, the new receptionist just handled a drunk VIP client in the lobby. Alone. No security needed." Holden was silent for a few seconds on the other end of the line. "How did she do it?" Franklin gave him the short version. Holden said nothing more, only ended the call. But Franklin had known his boss long enough to understand that the silence didn't mean he didn't care. It meant the opposite. The following week, the head of human resources knocked on Holden's office door. "Mr. Prescott, I'd like to recommend promoting the receptionist, Tessa Landry, to the position of executive assistant. Her abilities go far beyond her current role. She handles difficult situations better than some managers I've worked with." Holden looked at the proposal. He hadn't suggested it. He hadn't ordered it. This was entirely the decision of the Human Resources Department. He signed it. News of Tessa's promotion spread through the building in a single day, and only 2 days after that, the rumors exploded. Someone discovered that Tessa had once stayed inside the Prescott mansion. The story moved from one floor to another. "She lives in the boss's house. She was favored before she ever joined the company. Everyone understands how she climbed up." No one knew that the first anonymous messages planting the seed of that rumor had been sent from a phone in the hands of Monica Hale, the woman who had driven away from the Prescott mansion with eyes that didn't belong to someone who had given up. The same week Tessa was promoted, Holden Prescott was facing a problem far bigger than internal rumors. 2 consecutive shipments had been stopped by federal authorities before they could leave the eastern port of Chicago. The first shipment might have been bad luck. The second was betrayal. Someone inside Prescott Empire was selling information to the outside. Holden didn't call an emergency meeting. He didn't order a loud investigation. He did the opposite. He sat in his office with Franklin and wrote 5 different internal notices about the next shipment. Each version listed a different location, a different time, a different route. Then he sent each version to one department head. 5 people, 5 pieces of information, and only one of them would leak. All he had to do was sit back and wait to see which shipment got stopped. 2 days later, Franklin placed the results on Holden's desk. The shipment on the southern route had been stopped. The information about that route had been sent to only one person, Marcus Webb, head of logistics, a man who had worked for Prescott Empire for 7 years. Holden gave a slight nod when he read the name. Not surprised, not angry. He only said 2 words to Franklin: "Bring him up." That afternoon, Marcus Webb stepped into the private elevator and went up to the 42nd floor. He was inside Holden's office for 40 minutes. No one knew how that conversation went. No one heard shouting or the sound of a fist hitting a desk. But when Marcus came out of the elevator on the ground floor, his face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor, 2 security guards walking on either side of him. Marcus went straight to the main doors, without returning to his desk, without taking any personal belongings, without saying a word to anyone. He disappeared from Chicago that very night and was never seen again. Tessa was sitting behind the assistant's desk when the elevator opened. She saw Marcus step out, his face drained of color, his steps unsteady between the 2 guards. She didn't know what had happened on the 42nd floor, but she saw Marcus's eyes. The eyes of a man who had just seen something that made him want to leave this city as fast as possible. She turned back to her computer screen, but her hands paused over the keyboard for a few seconds. Holden Prescott's world wasn't like any world she had ever known. That same afternoon, Holden dealt with the remaining problem, the rumors about Tessa. He didn't hold a company-wide meeting. He didn't send out a general announcement. He called in 3 people privately. The 3 employees who had led the spread of the rumors about Tessa, the ones who had spoken the loudest, spoken the most, and spoken the cruelest. One by one, he called them up to his office. One by one, they stepped through the oak door. And one by one, they came back out. The first came out after 10 minutes, his face ashen, and walked straight back to his desk without looking at anyone. The second came out after 8 minutes, his hands trembling so badly he nearly dropped his employee badge when he swiped at the door. The third came out after 6 minutes, head lowered, moving quickly as though he were running away. From that afternoon on, No one in Prescott Tower mentioned Tessa Landry's name in any conversation that wasn't related to work. No one. But Holden wasn't done. That evening, Franklin placed a short report on his desk. It contained the traced source of the anonymous messages sent to company employees, the first messages that had planted the seeds for the entire wave of rumors. All of them led back to one phone number, Monica Hale's phone number. Holden read the report, folded it closed, and set it down on the desk. Franklin stood waiting for orders. "Do you want me to handle it?" "No," Holden answered, his voice quiet. "She only knows how to spread rumors. She's not dangerous enough for me to bother with." Franklin nodded and stepped out. He never argued with his boss, but if anyone had asked him years later, Franklin would have said this was the only time he thought Holden Prescott had misjudged someone. Monica Hale didn't only know how to spread rumors, she knew how to do things far worse than that, and she was waiting for the right moment. It started with a cup of coffee. Tessa had a habit of making coffee for everyone on the ground floor every evening, before her shift ended. She had done it since her first week there, with no one asking her, no one requiring it of her. She simply saw that people were tired at the end of the day, and a hot cup of coffee didn't take much time. One evening, Tessa brought documents up to the 42nd floor for Holden. She saw that the light in his office was still on. On his desk were 3 stacks of files, 2 phones, and nothing to drink. Tessa went back downstairs, made a cup of black coffee, brought it up, and placed it on his desk. Holden looked up at the cup of coffee, then looked at Tessa. "Do you do this for everyone?" Tessa nodded. "If someone's working late, I bring one." Holden looked at the cup of coffee for another moment, then said, his voice softer than usual, "This is the first time someone has brought me coffee without wanting anything." Tessa didn't answer. She only smiled faintly and walked out. But the next evening, she brought one up again. And the evening after that, without either of them saying it, it became a habit. Every night Holden worked late. Tessa brought coffee upstairs and placed it on his desk. Sometimes she stayed for a few minutes, drinking her own cup beside the glass wall that looked down over Chicago. Sometimes the two of them exchanged a few brief sentences. Sometimes there was only silence, until one night, when Tessa set the coffee down and was about to stand, Holden spoke. "Tessa." She stopped and looked at him. Holden leaned back in his chair, the desk lamp casting light over one half of his face. He looked at her, then looked toward the glass wall, then looked back at her. "I want these evenings to be about more than coffee." Tessa held her own cup of coffee, her fingers tightening slightly around the rim. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, then stood and said softly, "I need time." Then she walked out. Holden watched her until the door closed. He didn't call her back. He knew how to wait. A few days later, Tessa returned to the office at nearly 10 o'clock at night to get a file she had forgotten. The hallway on the 42nd floor was empty, with only a spill of light coming from the small conference room at the end of the corridor. As she walked past, she heard Holden's voice behind the half-closed door. His voice was low, slow, each word clear. "If he doesn't pay within 72 hours, you know what to do." Tessa stopped. She stood there for a few seconds, her hand gripping the file tightly. Then she walked away without looking back. She couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, while Edith was drinking tea in the mansion's sitting room, Tessa sat down beside her. "Mrs. Edith, what does the Prescott family really do?" Edith set her teacup down. She looked at Tessa, not avoiding her eyes, not speaking in circles. "This family was built from darkness, child. But Holden is trying to drag everything into the light. He isn't perfect, but he's the best man this world could have made." Tessa gave a small nod. She didn't ask anything more. That evening, Tessa brought coffee upstairs as usual. She placed the cup on Holden's desk, but this time she didn't sit in the chair by the window. She stood in front of his desk and looked straight into his eyes. "I heard the call last night." Holden didn't react. He looked at her and waited. "I don't need to know everything, but don't ever lie to me." Holden looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded, slowly and firmly. "I promise." Tessa pulled out the chair and sat down beside the window, drinking her own coffee. Chicago stretched below them, millions of lights flickering in the dark. The two of them sat there without saying another word. But from that night on, Tessa was no longer the girl who made coffee for the boss, and Holden was no longer the man sitting alone on the highest floor. She knew who he was. She chose to stay. One morning, about 2 weeks after that coffee night, Tessa carried a tray of tea up to Edith's room, as she did every day. She knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She gently pushed it open and stepped inside. Edith was sitting on the edge of the bed, her left hand clutching her chest, her right hand gripping the bed frame, her breathing heavy and broken. On the floor, a small pill case had rolled away, with pills scattered around the foot of the bed. Tessa set the tea tray down at once, hurried to Edith's side, and knelt to pick up the pill case. She read the name on the label. Nitroglycerin, heart medication. Tessa looked up. Edith was looking at her, her wrinkled eyes wide, filled with pain and fear. But it wasn't the illness she was afraid of. "Don't tell Holden." She gripped Tessa's wrist, her voice a whisper. "He'll lose control. Promise me." Tessa looked at the pill case in her hand, then looked back at Edith. She understood immediately. Edith had heart disease. She had been hiding it from her grandson, and now she was asking Tessa to keep that secret. "I promise," Tessa said softly. Then she picked up each pill from the floor, placed them back into the case, and set it on the nightstand. She helped Edith lie down, pulled the blanket over her, and sat beside her until the old woman's breathing became steady again. From that day on, Tessa took on another task no one knew about. Every morning before going to work, she checked Edith's pill case and counted the pills to make sure she had taken the right dose. She wrote out a medication schedule by hand and taped it to Edith's bedroom wall, the letters large and clear so Edith could read them without her glasses. Every evening when she returned to the mansion, she cooked plain porridge according to the diet she had looked up online for people with heart disease, then brought it up to Edith's room. On the nights Edith couldn't sleep, Tessa sat beside her bed and read aloud to her until she drifted off. No one in the mansion knew. The housekeepers only saw Tessa often going up to Mrs. Edith's room and thought the two of them simply liked talking. Holden was busy with work, coming home late every night, seeing that his grandmother was still healthy, still smiling, still drinking tea. He didn't know that every morning she looked that well because a young woman had been waking up at 6 o'clock to remind her to take her medicine. 3 weeks passed. One night, close to 2 o'clock in the morning, Tessa was lying in her room when she heard a crash from Edith's room, the sound of glass breaking, then a heavy thud. Tessa sprang up, ran into the hallway, and pushed open Edith's door. Edith was lying on the floor beside the overturned nightstand. A water glass shattered across the tile. Her hand was clutching her chest. Her face had turned grayish pale, and her lips were turning blue. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her breathing coming in short, broken bursts. An acute heart attack. Tessa didn't scream. She didn't run to call the housekeepers. She didn't call security. She didn't waste time panicking. She rushed to the nightstand, opened the pill case, took out a nitroglycerin tablet, and knelt beside Edith. She gently placed the pill under the old woman's tongue. Then, she took out her phone, called emergency services, gave the mansion's address, and clearly described the symptoms. Acute chest pain, female patient, 78 years old, history of heart disease. Her voice trembled, but every word was clear. After hanging up, she turned back to Edith. The old woman was breathing weakly, her eyes beginning to close. Tessa lifted her head and placed it on her lap, holding Edith's face in both hands. "Look at me." Edith opened her eyes slightly. "Breathe in. Slowly. Breathe out." Edith tried to take one short breath. "Good. Keep going, Mrs. Edith. Breathe in. Breathe out. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." Tessa held her like that for 12 minutes. The longest 12 minutes of her life. She talked non-stop, never pausing, her voice soft and steady, only to keep Edith awake. She told her about the tea she would make the next morning, about the bowl of porridge she would cook, about the book the two of them hadn't finished reading. She said anything she could think of, as long as Edith kept her eyes open, as long as she kept breathing. The ambulance arrived. The paramedics rushed in and placed Edith on a stretcher. Tessa held the old woman's hand and didn't let go, climbing into the ambulance with her. All the way to the hospital, Tessa kept her hand wrapped tightly around Edith's wrinkled one, her fingers squeezing gently every time the heart monitor gave an abnormal beep. Holden received Franklin's call at 2:30 in the morning. He rushed to the hospital, crossed the emergency ward hallway, and pushed open the room door. Edith was lying in bed with an oxygen mask over her face, the heart monitor blinking beside her. And sitting in the plastic chair next to the bed, her back slightly bent, her hand still holding Edith's, was Tessa. Her sleep clothes were wrinkled, her hair was messy, her eyes were red, and dried tears marked her cheeks. But she was still awake, still sitting there, still holding the old woman's hand. The doctor stepped out and looked at Holden. "Are you family?" Holden nodded, his eyes not leaving Edith. The doctor said, "She had an acute myocardial infarction. 5 more minutes and we wouldn't have been able to save her. This young woman saved her life. She gave her the right medication, called emergency services correctly, and kept her conscious the right way. Without her, she wouldn't have made it through tonight." Holden stood in the emergency room, looking at the doctor, then at Tessa. She didn't look up. She was still sitting there, her hand holding Edith's, her eyes lowered to the old woman's wrinkled hand, as if she were afraid that if she let go, Edith would disappear. Holden stepped closer. He pulled over a second plastic chair, placed it beside Tessa, and sat down. Then he did something no one had ever seen Holden Prescott do in front of another person. He reached out and took Tessa's hand, gently, without a word. Tessa felt his hand, warm and steady, closing around hers. She didn't turn toward him. She only squeezed back softly. The two of them sat there, in the emergency room, beneath the cold white neon lights, beside the old woman breathing through an oxygen mask. No candles, no music, no glass wall overlooking Chicago, only the steady sound of the heart monitor and 2 hands holding tightly to each other. That was the moment Holden Prescott knew for certain that the woman sitting beside him wasn't a passerby in his life. She was the one he wanted to keep. Edith Prescott stayed in the hospital for 2 weeks. When she was discharged, the doctor ordered absolute rest. But Edith was not the kind of woman who knew how to sit still. During her very first week back at the mansion, while Tessa was reminding her to take her morning medicine, Edith suddenly took her hand, her voice clearer than ever. "I nearly died, and the person who pulled me back was you. I don't want to wait anymore." Tessa still didn't understand what she meant when Edith called Franklin and gave a series of brief orders. Invite the press. Invite the close families. Hold it at the mansion. This weekend. Holden heard the news from Franklin and walked into his grandmother's room. "What are you planning to do?" Edith looked at her grandson and smiled. "What I should have done a long time ago." Holden stood there for a few seconds, looking at her. He knew that once Edith Prescott had made up her mind, no one on earth could change it, not even him. He turned and walked out without saying another word. That weekend afternoon, the Prescott mansion opened its doors to guests. Edith didn't let anything drag on. She rose from her wheelchair, Franklin supporting her on one side, and stepped forward before dozens of camera lenses, her voice slow but ringing clearly. "I invited everyone here today because I want to say one thing. A few weeks ago, I almost left this world. The person who pulled me back was not a doctor, not money, not power. It was a girl named Tessa Landry. She saved my life. She cared for me every day when no one knew I was ill. And today, I want the whole world to know that I want Tessa Landry to become the granddaughter-in-law of the Prescott family." The sitting room went silent for exactly 2 seconds. Then came the whispers, the nonstop clicking of cameras, the reporters calling out to one another. Tessa stood in the back, her eyes wide, her hands clasped tightly together. She had not known this was coming. Holden stood by the door, one hand in his trouser pocket, his face expressionless. But his eyes were on Tessa, and there was something in that gaze softer than usual. The news spread within hours. Social media exploded. Chicago news sites ran the headline, "Grandmother of the Prescott Empire declares she wants former Waitress as her grandson's wife." The comments split into 2 sides. Some praised Tessa as a real-life fairy tale. Others called her a social climber. But no one cared about that news more than Monica Hale. Monica was sitting in her apartment when her phone kept vibrating with news alerts. She opened a link, read the headline, then read it again. Her hand tightened around the phone so hard the case crackled. Holden's grandmother, the most powerful woman in the Prescott family, had just publicly chosen Tessa Landry, a waitress with nothing in her hands, as the future granddaughter-in-law. Everything Monica had built over the past several years, the image of Holden Prescott's girlfriend that she had tried to create in society, had been wiped away by one statement from a 78-year-old woman. Monica took a long breath, then picked up the phone. She scrolled through her contacts and stopped at a name she had never dared to call before: Genevieve Prescott, Holden's mother, the woman who lived apart from the family in a penthouse in New York, rarely interfering in family matters. But once she spoke, even Holden had to listen. Monica placed the call and waited through 3 rings. Genevieve's voice came through, cold and sharp. Monica, I haven't heard from you in a long time. Monica forced her voice to stay calm, but worried enough to sound sincere. Mrs. Prescott, I'm calling because I'm worried about Holden. There's a girl no one knows anything about. No family, no clear past. Living inside the family mansion, she's taking advantage of Mrs. Edith's kindness. And now Mrs. Edith is announcing to the press that she wants this girl as her granddaughter-in-law. I'm afraid Holden is being deceived. Monica deliberately left out every detail about Tessa saving Edith's life, about Tessa refusing gifts, about Tessa starting from a receptionist position. She kept only the parts that made Tessa look like an opportunist. The other end of the line was silent for a few seconds. Then Genevieve spoke, her voice slow and heavy. I'll fly back to Chicago tomorrow morning. Monica ended the call and set the phone on the table, the corner of her mouth curving upward. She thought of Tessa Landry, that small waitress, and she believed Genevieve Prescott would crush that girl within a week. But Monica didn't know Tessa. She had never understood people who had nothing to lose and still chose not to sell themselves. And that was Monica's biggest mistake, after Holden's biggest mistake. Both of them underestimated someone who should never have been underestimated. Genevieve Prescott arrived in Chicago the next morning, exactly as she had said she would. She didn't go to the mansion. She went straight to Prescott Tower, stepped into the private elevator up to the 42nd floor, and pushed open the door to Holden's office without knocking. Holden was sitting behind his desk, and he looked up at his mother. He wasn't surprised. Franklin had warned him. Mother, sit down, Genevieve said, her voice an order, not a greeting. She pulled out a chair and sat across from her son, her back straight, both hands resting on her lap. She wore a gray wool coat, her hair pinned high, everything about her radiating power and control. She was the female version of Holden, or more accurately, Holden was the male version of her. Explain this to me. Your grandmother announced to the press that she wants a waitress to become the daughter-in-law of the Prescott family. Are you planning to let this happen? Holden leaned back in his chair and looked at his mother. Tessa isn't a waitress, Mother. She's the executive assistant at my company, and she just saved grandmother's life. Genevieve waved a hand. Saved her life? Anyone who knows how to call an ambulance could have done that. It doesn't mean she deserves to step into this family. Holden looked at his mother without blinking. You flew back from New York just to say that? I flew back here to save you from a mistake. Genevieve leaned forward. You know what this family is? You know what this empire needs. A woman with no name, no family, no past, standing beside you will turn everything your father and grandfather built into a joke. Holden didn't answer right away. He looked at his mother for a long moment, then said slowly, Are you finished? Genevieve tightened her hands. Holden, I'm warning you. And I heard you. Holden stood and buttoned his suit jacket. But I'm not changing my mind. Genevieve walked out of Holden's office, her face cold as stone. She wasn't used to being refused. She was even less used to being refused by her own son. But Genevieve Prescott wasn't a woman who accepted defeat. She simply changed tactics. That very afternoon, Genevieve made 2 phone calls. 2 of Prescott Empire's largest partners, men who had invested hundreds of millions of dollars into the empire. She told each of them that Holden was losing control, that he was allowing an unknown girl to influence his decisions, that the empire was entering dangerous territory. She didn't lie. She merely twisted the truth just enough to make the listener worry. The next morning, both partners called Holden. The message was the same. We're considering pulling our capital. Holden ended the second call and sat still for 30 seconds. Then he picked up the phone and called each man back. When the first partner answered, Holden said, You want to pull out? Fine. I'll buy back your share within 24 hours. Market price, no negotiation. After 24 hours, the price will be different. There was 5 seconds of silence on the other end. Then, Holden, I only wanted 24 hours. Holden hung up and called the second partner. The same message, the same tone. No begging, no explanation, no negotiation. Just one number and one deadline. Less than 2 hours later, both partners called back and withdrew their intentions. No one dared pull money out of Prescott Empire when its owner was willing to buy them out at market price without blinking. That evening, Holden went to see his mother at the hotel where she was staying. He didn't sit down. He stood in front of Genevieve, his hands in his trouser pockets, his voice so quiet that Genevieve had to lean closer to hear him clearly. You're my mother, and I respect that. But this empire is mine. If you interfere in my business one more time, I'll treat you the same way I treat anyone who interferes with this empire." Genevieve looked at her son. She had given birth to him, raised him. But in that moment, the man standing before her wasn't the little boy she had once held in her arms. He was Holden Prescott, the boss. She shivered, for the first time in her life. But Genevieve wasn't someone who stopped after one loss. If she couldn't strike Holden, she would strike his weakest point: Tessa. By then, Tessa had moved out into a small apartment she rented herself with her assistant's salary. She wanted independence. She didn't want to keep staying at the mansion while everything was becoming complicated. The apartment was small, one room, in a working-class neighborhood on the west side of Chicago, but it was hers. Until Tuesday morning, when the landlord knocked on her door and said briefly, "The building has been sold to a new owner. You have 3 days to move out." Tessa looked at the landlord. She understood at once. She didn't need anyone to explain who the new owner was. She packed her things into the familiar cloth bag, along with the small cardboard box that held her books. When she carried her belongings out through the building's main entrance, a black car was parked by the curb. The door opened. Genevieve stepped out, wearing her wool coat, her hair pinned high, her eyes cold. She stood in front of Tessa and looked at the cloth bag and cardboard box at her feet. "Do you see now? In this world, money decides everything. You have no money, so you have no place. Leave my son. Everything will be easier for you." Tessa set her bag down on the ground. She looked at Genevieve, not angry, not crying, not pleading. Her voice was calm, every word clear. "You can buy my apartment, but you can't buy my decision." Then Tessa bent down, picked up her bag, tucked the cardboard box under her arm, turned around, and walked away. She didn't look back. Her back was straight, her steps steady, as if she were walking down a road she had chosen long ago, and no one on earth could force her to turn aside. Genevieve stood on the sidewalk, watching the small girl with the cloth bag disappear at the end of the street. For the first time in her life, Genevieve Prescott opened her mouth and had nothing to say. She stood there for a few more seconds, then got into the car. She flew back to New York that afternoon, returned to her penthouse, and didn't call Holden again. Not yet. Tessa found a new apartment in 2 days. It was smaller than the last one, on the 5th floor with no elevator, in a South Side Chicago neighborhood, but it was clean and had enough room for a bed, a small table, and that familiar cloth bag. She paid the first month's rent with half a month's salary as an assistant. She didn't tell Holden about Genevieve buying the building and forcing her out. She didn't tell anyone. She simply moved and kept working. But there was one person who knew exactly where Tessa was. 3 days after Tessa moved into the new apartment, a knock sounded at the door in the evening. Tessa opened it. Monica Hale stood in the hallway, holding a thick brown envelope in one hand, her mouth smiling while her eyes stayed cold. "May I come in?" Monica asked, her voice falsely sweet. Without waiting for an answer, she stepped through the doorway, looked around the small apartment, then sat down on the only chair beside the table. Tessa stood by the door, her hand still resting on the knob. She didn't close it. "I came so we could talk woman to woman." Monica placed the envelope on the table and pushed it toward Tessa. "No Holden, no grandmother, just you and me." Tessa looked at the envelope but didn't touch it. "What do you want, Monica?" Monica leaned forward, her expression shifting from sweetness to seriousness. "Do you know who the man you're in love with is? Who he really is?" She tapped a finger against the envelope. Inside are photographs, documents, evidence of what Prescott Empire really does behind those suits and that glass tower. "He isn't a businessman, Tessa. He's the leader of Chicago's underworld." Monica leaned back in the chair and crossed her arms. "If you don't leave, I'll send all of this to the press. Every news site in Chicago will run it. You'll be dragged into the mud with him. Your career, your life, all of it will be destroyed." Tessa looked at the envelope on the table. Then she looked at Monica. She didn't pick it up. She didn't open it to see. She only reached out and pushed the envelope back toward Monica, gently, with just the tips of her fingers. "I know who Holden is." Monica blinked. The smile disappeared. "What did you say?" "I know who Holden is," Tessa repeated, her voice calm. "I don't need you to show me evidence. I know where this family came from. I know what his world is like." I asked, and I was given the truth. Monica stood up, her eyes wide. "You know, and you're still staying? You know what he is, and you're still choosing to stand beside him?" Tessa stepped away from the door, walked to the table, picked up the envelope, and placed it in Monica's hand. Then she returned to the open door, stood beside it, and looked straight into Monica's eyes. You look at Holden and only see a wallet. I look at Holden and see a human being. That's the difference between you and me, and that's why he'll never choose you. Monica stood in the middle of the room, clutching the envelope, her face flushed red. She wanted to say something else, wanted to shout, wanted to threaten, but there wasn't a single sentence in her mind that could break the calm on Tessa Landry's face. Get out of my home, Tessa said, her voice neither rising nor falling, only clear and final, like a door being shut. Monica walked out. Her heels struck the hallway floor, quick and hurried, without the confident rhythm they had carried when she came in. Tessa closed the door, leaned her back against the wood, shut her eyes, and took a long breath. Her hands were trembling slightly. She wasn't afraid of Monica. She was afraid that one day, Holden's world would swallow her whole. But she had chosen. And she wasn't someone who changed her choice. Out in the hallway, Monica went down the stairs, her hand gripping the crumpled envelope. She had tried using money, like Genevieve. Failed. She had tried using threats. Failed. She had tried using the truth. Still failed. Nothing could move Tessa Landry with words. Then Monica wouldn't use words anymore. She would use action. And that action had already begun taking shape in her mind the moment she sat in her car, the envelope of photographs thrown onto the passenger seat, both hands gripping the steering wheel, her eyes fixed straight ahead on Prescott Tower, glowing against the Chicago skyline. 2:00 in the morning. Prescott Tower was silent, like a giant block of steel asleep in the dark. Monica Hale walked through the side door at the back of the building and swiped a cloned access card she had secretly obtained from a compromised insider. She knew the layout of the security system from the time when her father was still a partner of the Prescott family, allowing her to slip past the night guards. The green light blinked, and the door opened. Monica stepped inside, took the stairs down to the basement, and entered the document storage room. She knew exactly which drawer held the confidential files because she had come in and out of this building hundreds of times over the past several years. She pulled out a thick file, slipped it into her handbag, then took the elevator to Tessa's floor. Tessa's desk sat right beside the window, neat and orderly, with only a pen cup and a small photograph on it. Monica opened the second drawer, tucked the file inside, and pushed it shut again. She walked out, took the stairs down, swiped her card at the side door, and disappeared into the Chicago night. The entire process took less than 20 minutes. The next morning, Tessa arrived at Prescott Tower at 7 o'clock, as she did every day. She stepped out of the elevator on the floor where she worked, and immediately felt that something was wrong. 4 security guards were standing near her desk, and 2 men in suits she had never seen before were speaking with the head of security. Franklin stood nearby, his face expressionless, but his eyes turned to her the moment she came out of the elevator. Miss Landry. The head of security stepped forward. We received a report that confidential documents were moved from the storage room last night. A preliminary check shows that the documents are currently in your desk drawer. Tessa looked at him. Then she looked over at her desk, where a security guard was standing beside the open drawer, and inside it was a thick file she had never seen in her life. She understood at once. She didn't know who had done it, but she knew what was happening. The head of security looked at her, waiting for a reaction. The guards stood around her. Employees at other desks lifted their heads and whispered. Tessa didn't say, "I'm innocent." She didn't cry. She didn't call Holden's name. She walked to her desk, opened the first drawer, and took out a few personal things. A pen, a small notebook, the photograph. She placed them all into her handbag. Then she removed the employee badge from around her neck and set it on the desktop, gently and neatly. "I didn't do this," she said, her voice clear, not trembling. "But I won't stay in a place where people don't believe me." Then Tessa Landry turned around, stepped into the elevator, and pressed the button for the ground floor. The steel doors closed. No one stopped her. No one called after her. She walked out of Prescott Tower and along the Chicago street in the morning, losing everything she had just built for the 3rd time in her life. But this time, she hadn't only lost a job and a home. She had lost Holden, too. At the Prescott mansion, the news that Tessa had left reached Edith before Holden even knew. A housekeeper happened to mention, "Miss Tessa doesn't seem to be coming to the company anymore." Edith was drinking tea, and her hand stopped in midair. Where did the child go? No one could answer. Edith set the teacup down, stood, walked into the hallway, and called Tessa's name. There was no answer. She opened the door to Tessa's room. The bed was neatly folded, the closet was empty, and there was no cloth bag anywhere. Edith stood in the middle of the empty room, both hands hanging at her sides, her wrinkled eyes blinking. The girl was gone. From that day on, Edith changed. She didn't smile anymore. She sat in her room all day, skipped meals, and forgot to take her medicine. Without Tessa reminding her every morning, the pill case sat untouched on the nightstand, the pills not decreasing. Without Tessa cooking porridge every evening, she took a few careless bites and pushed the plate away. The housekeepers didn't know her medication schedule. They didn't know which pill was supposed to be taken before meals and which one after. They only realized she had heart disease when she began struggling to breathe on the third day. Holden learned that Edith had been hospitalized for the second time while he was sitting in his office, reviewing the basement security footage from the night of the incident, trying to find out exactly how the documents had been planted. He rushed to the mansion. The private doctor was examining Edith. Holden stepped into her room and saw her lying in bed, her face gray, her breathing heavy. His eyes dropped to the nightstand. The pill case was still full. Then he looked at the wall. A handwritten note was taped above the head of the bed, the letters round and neat. Morning, white pill before eating. Noon, pink pill after eating. Night, yellow pill before sleep. Tessa's handwriting. Holden stared at that note for a long time. A very long time. Then he turned to the housekeeper standing by the door. Who has been taking care of her all this time? The housekeeper looked down. Miss Tessa, sir. Every day. She reminded Mrs. Edith to take her medicine, cooked porridge for her, stayed up late to watch over her while she slept. She didn't tell anyone. She said, Mrs. Edith didn't want you to worry. Holden stood in the middle of the room, looking at the pill case that was still full, looking at the handwritten note, looking at his grandmother breathing with difficulty in bed. The girl he had let walk away had been keeping his grandmother alive for months, and he hadn't known. Holden stepped out into the hallway, leaned his back against the wall, and closed his eyes. I underestimated Monica, thinking she was only a nuisance. I didn't think she would dare to breach our security system. I was wrong. He opened his eyes, took out his phone, and called Franklin. The basement cameras from that night. Find it for me. Find it now. It took Franklin less than 1 hour to find what Holden needed. The basement camera had recorded everything clearly. At 2:47 in the morning, a woman swiped her card at the side door, took the stairs down to the storage room, removed the documents, went up to Tessa's floor, opened her desk drawer, slipped them inside, then left. The woman's face was perfectly clear under the hallway lights. Monica Hale. Holden watched the footage twice. The first time to confirm it, the second time to remember it. Then he turned off the screen and sat still in his office for a long while. Franklin stood waiting. Do you want me to send this video to the police? Holden shook his head. Call Monica. Tell her I want to see her at the mansion this afternoon. Tell her I want to thank her for helping uncover the document incident. Franklin looked at his boss. He didn't ask why. He had worked with Holden long enough to know that when Holden invited someone over to thank them, it was not a thank you. At 3:00 in the afternoon, Monica walked into the Prescott mansion, her high heels striking the familiar stone floor. She wore a black dress, her hair was sleekly brushed, and a smug smile rested on her lips. In her mind, everything was perfect. Tessa had been thrown out. Tessa had left. And now, Holden wanted to see her to thank her. Perhaps he had finally realized who truly deserved to stand beside him. Holden stood in the sitting room beside the liquor cabinet. He poured 2 glasses of whiskey, turned around, and handed one to Monica. Sit down. Monica sat in the chair, crossed her legs, and took a sip of whiskey. She smiled. Holden, I'm glad you called me here. I know what happened with Tessa disappointed you, but I told you from the beginning she wasn't the right person for Monica. Holden cut her off, his voice gentle, as though he were asking about the weather. What time did you go into the storage room that night? The glass in Monica's hand stopped in midair. The smile on her lips froze. Her eyes blinked quickly, once, then twice. What? I don't understand what you're talking about. Holden set his own glass down on the table, slowly. 2:47 in the morning. The backside door. You swiped a cloned card, thinking you could trick our digital logging system. You went down to the basement, entered the storage room, took confidential documents, then went up to Tessa's floor, opened her desk drawer, and planted them inside. Holden looked straight into Monica's eyes. The basement camera recorded it very clearly, Monica. Every step. Every second. The glass in Monica's hand began to tremble. She set it on the table, her fingers clumsy, whiskey spilling across the glass surface. She stood and looked toward the door. Franklin had been standing there for some time. 2 bodyguards stood on either side, arms folded in front of their chests, faces expressionless. The door was closed. Monica turned back to Holden. He had already stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and was walking slowly toward her. Not hurried, not angry, just calm in a way that was terrifying. You know the Prescott family's rule for traitors. His voice was low and quiet, each word falling into the still air of the room. Monica stepped back until her back touched the wall behind her. She had nowhere left to go. Her eyes reddened, and her voice began to break. Holden, I did everything because I love you. Don't you understand? I've been beside you for years. I waited for you. I did everything to be worthy of you, and you chose a waitress instead of me? Holden stopped about 1 meter from Monica. He looked at her, and for the first time in that conversation, something changed on his face. It was not anger. It was not pity. It was disappointment. You don't love me, Monica. You love the Prescott name. You love the car you drive, the parties you're invited to, the doors that open when you say you know me. You don't love me. You love power. Monica opened her mouth, but no sound came out. As for Tessa, Holden continued, his voice still quiet, but every word heavy as lead. She doesn't love power. She loves a man when she knows exactly who he is, knows exactly how dark his world is, and still chooses to stay. She refused a free apartment, refused money, refused to bow before my mother, and refused your threats too. Do you know why? Because she doesn't need anything from me, and that is something you'll never understand. Holden turned to Franklin and gave a slight nod. Take her out. Blacklist her from the system. Ban Monica Hale from stepping into any Prescott Empire property. From today on, this name no longer exists in our system. Franklin stepped forward. The 2 bodyguards opened the door. Monica looked at Holden one last time, her eyes red, her lips pressed tightly together, but no tears fell. She was not someone who knew how to truly cry. She walked out of the mansion for the last time, her heels striking the stone floor, each step farther than the one before, until the iron gate closed behind her. Holden stood in the sitting room, looking at the unfinished glass of whiskey Monica had left on the table. A lipstick stain still marked on the rim. He picked it up, poured the whiskey down the sink, then dropped the glass into the trash. He took out his phone and called Franklin. Now find Tessa for me. Monica Hale left the Prescott mansion empty-handed, with no access card, no name left in the system, and nothing left at all. She sat in her car, both hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at the iron gate closing behind her. Everything she had built over the past several years, her connection to the Prescott family, her image in society, the doors that had always opened whenever she said her name, all of it was over, and all of it was because of Tessa Landry. Monica drove back to her apartment and sat in the dark for nearly an hour. Then she opened her phone and scrolled to a number she had never dared to call before. Conrad Voss, the strongest opposing force against Prescott Empire on the south side of Chicago. The man whose name she knew because her father had once mentioned him in conversations she wasn't supposed to hear, but had heard anyway. Monica placed the call. Conrad answered after 2 rings, his voice hoarse and cautious. Who is this? Monica Hale, Warren Hale's daughter. I have something you need. Silence held for 3 seconds. Then, I'm listening. Monica spoke quickly, briefly, precisely. She gave Conrad Tessa Landry's daily schedule. What time she went to work, what time she came home, the shortcut she usually walked through every evening after stopping at the supermarket to buy food, the narrow alley behind the apartment building where there were no cameras and Franklin's coverage didn't reach. That girl is Holden Prescott's only weakness, Monica said. You want Prescott Empire? Start with her. Conrad hung up. He didn't thank her. He didn't need to. 2 days later, at 6 o'clock in the evening, Tessa was walking back from the supermarket to her new apartment. She was carrying a small bag of groceries, taking the shortcut through the alley behind the apartment building, as she did every day. The alley was narrow, with high walls on both sides and a flickering streetlight at the far end. She was halfway through when a black car rolled forward and blocked the way ahead. The doors opened. 2 men stepped out and walked straight toward her. Tessa stepped back and turned around, but behind her, a second car had already blocked the other exit. She was trapped between them. Everything happened in less than 15 seconds. The two men came forward, one holding her shoulders, the other forcing her into the black car. The grocery bag fell to the ground, and cans rolled across the asphalt. The car sped away. Tessa sat inside the car, her hands tied with plastic zip ties, her eyes covered with a black cloth. She didn't scream. She counted. She counted each second, each turn, each time the car slowed down. She guessed the drive lasted about 40 minutes, leaving the city and heading toward the southern suburbs. The car stopped. She was taken into a wide space, where footsteps echoed against a concrete floor. A warehouse. The blindfold was removed. Tessa looked around. An abandoned warehouse, an old wooden table, 2 plastic chairs, and 1 ceiling bulb. 2 guards stood near the main door. At that moment, Holden Prescott was sitting in the car with Franklin, on the way to find Tessa after the order he had given once he exposed Monica. His phone rang. "Unknown number," he answered. "Holden Prescott." Conrad Voss's voice came slowly through the line. "I have the thing you care about most. The girl named Tessa. She's with me. If you want her back, sign over the 3 southern port zones." Holden sat still in the car, phone in his hand, eyes fixed straight ahead. He didn't shout. He didn't break anything. He didn't ask, "Is she hurt?" He said only 3 words. "I understand." Then he hung up. He turned to Franklin. "Activate the entire southern network. Track the call location. I need to know where she is within 4 hours." Franklin made call after call. 4 hours later, they identified the warehouse in the suburbs, an abandoned industrial district 40 minutes from downtown Chicago. Holden called his own people. He didn't call the police. Inside the warehouse, Tessa didn't sit still and wait. As soon as the 2 guards turned to speak to each other, she began moving her wrists back and forth, rubbing the zip ties against the edge of the wooden table behind her. The plastic cut into her skin, sharp and burning, but she didn't stop. She kept rubbing, steadily, patiently. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The tie began to loosen. Tessa pulled one hand free, then the other. She looked around. The light switch was on the wall to the right, 3 steps away from her. The wooden table she had just used to cut the ties was right beside her. She drew in a breath, gathered her strength, and shoved the table into the switch on the wall. The crash rang out. The switch flipped. The ceiling bulb went dark, and the warehouse sank into complete darkness. The 2 guards shouted, stumbling blindly in the dark. Tessa had memorized the position of the back door from the moment they brought her in. She ran. Her feet struck the concrete floor, her breathing hard, her hands reaching in the dark for the doorframe. She touched the metal bar of the back door, shoved hard, and streetlight spilled in. She stepped outside, ran 3 more steps, then crashed into someone walking in from the outside. Tessa looked up. Holden stood in front of her. Black coat, sharp eyes, and behind him were Franklin and 3 more men. Holden looked at her, looked at the broken plastic ties hanging from her wrists, then looked into her eyes. She wasn't crying. She was breathing hard, her hair messy, her hands scraped, but her eyes were clear. He took her hand and gently pulled her behind him, leaving Franklin and his men to handle the inside. Conrad Voss stepped out through the main warehouse door when he saw car lights flooding the entire lot. He looked around and understood at once. Holden's men had surrounded the whole warehouse. Black cars covered all 4 sides. No way out. Holden stepped forward, Tessa standing behind him. He looked at Conrad, his voice calm. "She has nothing to do with our business." Conrad curled his mouth. "She became involved the moment you loved her." Holden gave a slight nod, as if agreeing with an interesting observation. "True. And that's exactly why you should be afraid. Because anyone who touches her will lose far more than 3 port zones." Holden glanced at the watch on his wrist. "You have 60 seconds to leave." Conrad looked around, counted the cars, counted the men, and once he finished counting, he knew he had lost. He stepped back, raised both hands, and ordered his people to retreat. Conrad's cars left the lot first. Holden's cars left afterward. Tessa sat in the car beside Holden, silent through the first 10 minutes. Her hands rested in her lap, the scrapes around her wrists red under the car light. Then she spoke, her voice so calm that Holden had to turn and look at her. "I don't need you to save me, but I'm glad you came." Holden looked at her. Then he smiled. Not the controlled smile, not the polite smile, not the smile he used in boardrooms or in front of enemies. A real smile, the smile of a man who had just found the thing he feared losing most, and had discovered that thing didn't need him to save it. It could save itself. The car crossed the bridge, heading back toward downtown Chicago, the city lights gradually appearing ahead. Holden reached over and took Tessa's scraped hand. She squeezed back softly. Neither of them said another word. There was no need. News of the kidnapping spread through Chicago's business circles within only a few hours. No one knew the details, but everyone knew enough. An opposing force had dared to strike directly at the person closest to Holden Prescott, and that meant the Prescott empire was being challenged. The next morning, the two largest investors in Prescott Empire called Franklin with the same message. "We need to see Holden immediately. We're considering pulling our capital." Franklin reported it to Holden. Holden sat in his office, and in front of him was a map of Conrad Voss's entire business network on the south side of Chicago, which Franklin had compiled overnight. He was planning to wipe Conrad out, not with bullets, but with something far more painful: money. He had no time for investors. Tessa stood by the office door. She heard Franklin report the two calls. She looked at Holden and saw him frown, his hand still resting on the map of Conrad's network. He had to choose between two fronts: deal with Conrad before the man could strike back, or keep the investors in place before their withdrawal caused panic across the entire empire. Tessa stepped into the room. "Let me." Holden looked up. "You handle Conrad. I'll handle the investors." Holden looked at her. He had never let anyone besides Franklin handle something important, but he looked into Tessa's eyes, the same eyes that had stayed clear and awake in that pitch-black warehouse 24 hours earlier, and he knew she wasn't saying it lightly. "Are you sure? I don't know the underworld, but I know how to talk to people who are afraid." Holden was silent for 3 seconds. Then he picked up the phone, called each investor, and said briefly, "My representative will meet with you this afternoon. She speaks for me." He hung up. Then he looked at Tessa and gave a slight nod. That same afternoon, 2 fronts opened at the same time. Tessa sat in the conference room on the 42nd floor, facing the 2 investors. 2 older men, gray suits, tense faces. They had come out of respect for Holden, but when they saw a young woman sitting across from them instead of the head of Prescott Empire, they couldn't hide their doubt. "Who are you?" the first man asked. "I'm Tessa Landry. Mr. Prescott has authorized me." "Can you explain what's happening?" the second man asked, his voice heavy. Tessa didn't speak in circles. "I'm not going to pretend everything is fine. You're right to be concerned. But I'm not asking you to stay. I'm asking for 72 hours. After 72 hours, if you still want to withdraw, Prescott Empire will buy back your shares at market price. Not 1 day late." The 2 investors looked at each other. They had prepared for a long negotiation, for promises and vague explanations. They hadn't prepared for a young woman to look them straight in the eye and tell the truth without begging. 72 hours? The first man asked again. 72 hours, Tessa nodded. The 2 men looked at each other once more, then they nodded. At the same time, Holden began to strike, not with fists, with phone calls. He called every one of Conrad Voss's suppliers, one by one, the same sentence every time. "Starting today, anyone who delivers goods to Voss won't deliver goods to Prescott anymore. Choose." No one chose Voss. Prescott Empire held 60% of the northern market. Losing Prescott meant losing more than half their revenue. On the second day, Franklin contacted the 3 banks where Conrad had loans. Holden didn't ask the banks to do anything. He simply sent them Conrad's real financial report, the one Conrad had hidden for 2 years. The banks decided on their own to freeze the accounts. On the third day, Conrad's largest partner in the South announced that he was pulling out. Conrad Voss sat in his empty office, watching his empire fall apart piece by piece, without a single gunshot being fired. He picked up the phone and called Holden. "You destroyed me." Conrad's voice was hoarse. Holden replied, his voice calm as always. "You touch someone who belongs to me. You lost everything. That's the rule." Conrad Voss left Chicago that weekend. No noise, no announcement, simply gone. The entire Southern Territory fell into Prescott's hands without costing a single drop of blood. 72 hours after the meeting with Tessa, the 2 investors called back. Neither one withdrew. When Holden learned what Tessa had done, he asked, "Where did you get the number 72 from?" Tessa smiled faintly. "Nowhere. I just knew how much time you needed to finish it." Holden looked at her for a long time. This was when he knew for certain that Tessa Landry wasn't only the woman he loved, she was the woman who could stand beside him. 2 days later, Monica Hale was arrested by the FBI at O'Hare International Airport while trying to board a flight to Los Angeles. Holden had handed over all the evidence of Monica providing information to Conrad to federal authorities. She stepped into the police car, her hands cuffed, and didn't look back. No one came to see her off. That night, after everything had settled, Holden and Tessa sat in the office on the highest floor of Prescott Tower. No coffee, no documents, only the two of them and the glass wall looking out over Chicago at night. Holden leaned back in his chair, his eyes turned outward, but he wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at someplace much farther away, a place he rarely returned to. My mother left when I was 10 years old. Tessa sat still. She didn't ask. She didn't interrupt. She only listened. She couldn't bear this life. The midnight phone calls, the strangers coming and going, the things she saw but wasn't allowed to ask about. One morning, she stood at the door with a suitcase, looked at me, and said, "Come with me." I looked at her, then looked at my grandmother standing in the kitchen. I chose to stay. My mother walked out the door and never came back. Holden was silent for a few seconds. I got used to people leaving. My mother, my father, friends, partners. Everyone had a reason. Everyone had a limit. And I learned that you shouldn't try to keep anyone, because keeping them doesn't change anything. Tessa looked at him. She saw Holden Prescott, the boss whom all of Chicago's underworld called by those two words. The boss, sitting there with the eyes of a 10-year-old child watching his mother walk out the door. She reached out and placed her hand over his. "Your mother didn't abandon you. She wasn't strong enough to stay. Those are two different things." Holden turned to look at her. No one had ever said that to him before. No one had ever separated those two things for him. Leaving because you don't love someone, and leaving because you don't have the strength to endure, are completely different things. And for 23 years, he had made them one. He said nothing. He only turned his hand over, took Tessa's hand, and squeezed it softly. That was all he needed to say. The next morning, Genevieve Prescott left her penthouse in New York, but not to fly back to Chicago to see Holden. She hired a car and went to an address she had quietly searched for all through the night, the orphanage where Tessa Landry had grown up. She came alone. She told no one. She stepped through the gate and looked around the small grounds. There was a playground with swings, a few plastic chairs, and walls painted with bright pictures. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and orderly. The director came out to greet her, startled to see a woman dressed like Genevieve standing at the gate. Genevieve didn't introduce herself. She only asked, "Did a girl named Tessa Landry grow up here?" The director nodded, her eyes brightening. "Tessa? She's our pride. She grew up here from the time she was little, completely on her own. Every month, she still sends money back to the orphanage, even though her income is barely enough. Whenever she's free on weekends, she comes back and teaches the children to read." Genevieve listened and said nothing. She looked out at the yard. A little girl, about 6 years old, was sitting in the corner of the playground, holding a picture book, murmuring each word as she read. Genevieve walked out, went over to the little girl, and sat down beside her. "What are you reading?" The little girl looked up, smiled wide, showing a missing tooth, and proudly held up the book. "A book Sister Tessa gave me. Sister Tessa said that if I know how to read, I'll have the whole world as my friend." Genevieve looked at the child. That radiant smile, those clear eyes, the book held tightly in her hands. And she saw Holden's shadow. Holden from years ago, 10 years old, sitting alone inside that vast mansion after his mother left, with only books for friends, with only his grandmother as family, the child before her and her son. 2 different worlds, but the same absence. And Tessa, the girl she had looked down on, had done for these children what Genevieve had failed to do for her own son. She had stayed with them. Genevieve stood, thanked the director, and walked out through the gate. She didn't cry at the orphanage. She cried in the car, on the way back to the hotel, alone. That evening, Genevieve called Tessa. Tessa came to meet her at the hotel, stunned to see Genevieve waiting for her in the lobby, not with the cold face from before, but with red eyes and slightly trembling hands. Genevieve stood, walked toward her, and took both of Tessa's hands. For the first time, she touched her, not to pressure her, not to threaten her, but to hold on to her. "My son was once a child like the children in that orphanage. His mother left, his father was busy, and he grew up with his grandmother and books. And you did what I couldn't do. You stayed with the children who needed you. You stayed with Holden's grandmother when she needed you. You stayed with Holden when he needed you. Genevieve stopped, her voice choking. I was wrong about you, and I'm sorry. Tessa looked at the woman in front of her, the woman who had bought her apartment building to force her out, the woman who had called her a nobody, now standing there, holding her hands and crying. Tessa gently squeezed her hands and nodded. She said nothing. She didn't need to. 1 week later, Holden took Tessa to a place she never expected. The car stopped in front of the Gilded Table, the most luxurious restaurant in Chicago, the place where she had once washed dishes, had once had her tip stolen, had once been fired because she dared to invite an old woman to sit at a table. Tessa looked at the restaurant sign through the car window, her heart beating fast. Why are we here? Holden opened the car door for her. Come in. They stepped inside. The dining room was still the same, the floor polished until it gleamed, the chandelier sparkling, the employees in black uniforms, and standing behind the manager's counter, Denise Carver was still there, still wearing that arrogant face, still carrying eyes that looked down on everyone, until she saw who had just walked through the door. Denise's face went pale. Tessa Landry, the waitress she had fired, standing beside Holden Prescott, the owner of the entire empire this restaurant belonged to. Holden walked straight up to Denise. He wasn't angry. He didn't raise his voice. He only looked at her and said, I kept you here all these months. Do you know why? Denise shook her head, her eyes wide. Because I wanted you to see this day. You're fired. Discrimination and bullying have no place in my empire. Denise stood there, her mouth open, but no sound came out. The employees around them stood still and watched. No one laughed. No one spoke. Denise removed her manager's badge, placed it on the counter, and walked out the door. Holden turned to Tessa. The restaurant was quiet. Then he did something no one in that restaurant, no one in the entire city of Chicago, had ever imagined Holden Prescott would do. He took a small black velvet box from his coat pocket and went down on one knee on the restaurant floor. Tessa looked down at him. He opened the box, and inside was a diamond ring. Tessa Landry, you're the first person who saw me. Not the empire, not the power, but me. Will you stay with me? Tessa looked at him. She didn't cry. She only bent down, took the hand he was holding out with the ring, squeezed it softly, and said one word. Yes. One day before the wedding, Tessa drove to the orphanage where she had grown up. She didn't bring her wedding dress. She didn't bring diamonds. She brought only herself. The orphanage director met her at the gate, hugged her tightly, then led her into the storage room in the back. She opened an old iron cabinet and took out a small cardboard box that had yellowed with time. I've kept this for you for almost 20 years. I was waiting for the day you came back to take it. Tessa opened the box. Inside was a bracelet braided from rope, the cord frayed and faded by the years. On the face of the bracelet, 2 letters had been clumsily carved by the hand of an 8-year-old child, T.L. Tessa Landry. She remembered the day she made that bracelet, the first day she came to the orphanage, knowing no one, owning nothing but the clothes on her body. She had sat in the corner of the yard, found a piece of rope, braided it into a bracelet, and carved her name into it, because she was afraid that if she didn't carve it there, no one would remember she had ever existed. Tessa held the bracelet in her hand, her fingers brushing over those old letters. She didn't cry. She only held it tightly, then put it on her left wrist. The next morning was the wedding day. Tessa wore a white dress, with the diamond necklace Holden had given her around her neck, but on her left wrist, beside the new watch, was the worn rope bracelet. Holden waited for her at the end of the aisle, watching her walk toward him, then his eyes stopped on her wrist. What's that bracelet? Tessa looked down at her wrist and smiled. This reminds me where I came from, so I'll never forget. Holden looked at the rope bracelet, then at the diamond necklace, then into her eyes. He said nothing. He only took the hand wearing that rope bracelet and held it tighter. It was the largest wedding in Chicago that year. The Prescott Mansion opened its doors to hundreds of guests, from business partners to the closest families. But no one was more important than the woman sitting in the front row. Edith Prescott, 78 years old, sat in a wheelchair, wearing a traditional elegant gown, her wrinkled hands resting on a small wooden box. When Tessa and Holden finished the ceremony, Edith signaled for Franklin to wheel her forward to the bride. She opened the wooden box with trembling hands. Inside was the Prescott family heirloom brooch, old gold set with blue stones, passed down through 3 generations. "This brooch belongs to the woman who carries the Prescott family legacy," Edith said, her voice weak but clear with every word. "And today, I give it to you." Tessa knelt in front of the wheelchair and held Edith's trembling hands. Edith pinned the brooch to the front of her dress, her hands shaking so much that she had to fasten it twice. Tessa held her hands and said softly, "I'm not going anywhere anymore." Edith looked at her, her wrinkled eyes shimmering. "I know." Behind the rows of guests, a special small group sat in the right corner. The children from the orphanage, dressed beautifully, their hair neatly combed, their eyes wide as they looked around the magnificent mansion. When Tessa turned to look at them, the children clapped and cheered, smiling brightly. The little girl Genevieve had once met in the orphanage yard waved at Tessa, grinning from ear to ear. Tessa waved back. Genevieve stood behind the rows of seats, looking at the children, looking at Tessa, then turned her face away and wiped her tears with the back of her hand. 1 year after the wedding, Tessa Landry Prescott stood before hundreds of people in a large hall in downtown Chicago. She announced the opening of a charity foundation named The Next Step, dedicated to supporting young people in hardship, helping them learn trades, find work, and build new lives. Holden sat in the front row, watching Tessa speak, and in his eyes was a light Franklin said he had never seen in his boss in all the 10 years he had worked with him. That evening, Holden gave Tessa a set of documents. She opened them, the ownership transfer papers for the Gilded Table. "I bought it. From now on, it's yours. Do whatever you want with it." Tessa looked at the papers, looked at the name of the restaurant where she had once carried trays, washed dishes, had her tips stolen, and been pointed at and thrown out. She turned the Gilded Table into a vocational training center for young people in hardship. The restaurant still served guests, but behind the kitchen was a classroom. Every new employee was someone who needed a chance, just like Tessa once had. And the first rule Tessa posted on the kitchen wall was, "Anyone who walks through this door deserves respect. Anyone." One afternoon, Tessa stood in the middle of that restaurant, watching the young trainees learning, laughing, and serving guests with real smiles. She looked down at her left wrist. The rope bracelet was still there, beside the diamond watch Holden had given her for her birthday. She remembered the day she had held a silver tray and stood in this very restaurant, with Denise pointing at her in front of dozens of employees. She remembered the old woman in the worn coat sitting at the table by the window, drinking the warm water Tessa had poured. She remembered the crumpled tip money she had placed on the table, and she understood that dignity wasn't in the silver tray she had once carried, nor was it in the diamond she was now wearing. It was in the moment she chose to pour a glass of water for an old woman no one else bothered to look at. It was in every time she was knocked down and still stood back up, still refused to sell herself, still remained herself even when the world tried to change her. Good people don't always meet good things, but dignity, that is something no one can give you, and no one can take away. This story is for everyone who feels too small in this world. You aren't small, you just haven't met the right person who can see your worth. But whether you meet them or not, your dignity is still yours. No one can buy it. No one can take it away. If today's story touched your heart, please hit the like button to support us so we can continue telling stories like this. Share this video with someone you want to hear today's message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next stories. We'd truly love to know how this story made you feel. Please leave a comment below and share the thoughts from deep inside your heart. We read every comment, and every word you share is what motivates us to keep going every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Thank you for listening. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.